Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. With the deadliest attack on Israel in 50 years, should Taiwan be looking to avoid the failure in intelligence that left Tel Aviv unprepared for the Hamas massacre? With me to discuss this are Ivan Kanapathy, Beacon Global Strategy's Vice President and former U.S. National Security Council Deputy Senior Director for Asian Affairs and Director for China, Taiwan and Mongolia. Ivan is visiting from Washington, D.C. And Tony Hu, former U.S. Department of Defense Senior Director for China, Taiwan and Mongolia. Ivan, Tony, a very warm welcome to the show today.
Hi.
Tony, let me start with you. So the element of surprise was obviously a key factor in the Hamas attack. How can we characterize that attack compared with what we might expect from China on Taiwan?
Well, you're right. It was a surprise attack, and this multi-domain attack shows it's likely an intelligence failure on Israel's part and possibly even on the U.S. part. So my concern is this type of warfare, Hamas basically threw the basic accepted rules of armed conflict out the window. They went after non-combatants. When in regular warfare, basically, we have combatants, engaged combatants, and in this case, they actually sought out unarmed civilians and either killed or kidnapped them. So this is troublesome. But as far as facing China, I suspect this will be a different way. It'll be a normal kind of warfare because you'll be between two countries. And if Taiwan ever had to face China, this type of surprise would be hard to execute for China. And I think also we will have a lot more warning. Our ability to detect any type of preparation will be much better than what happened with this particular attack. I think Hamas was able to smuggle in all those rockets and also train on those power gliders. They had to train somewhere, and somebody had to provide those power gliders. Somehow they were able to smuggle those in without being detected.
So Hamas's small-scale attack versus obviously a large-scale attack by China. Ivan, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that the U.S. didn't have the intelligence to predict this attack. Should it have also predicted something small scale like this?
I think in hindsight, I'm sure everyone's going to say it should have. The reality behind the intelligence community is there are a finite amount of resources, and you have to position them depending on what the policy requirements are. And if Israel wasn't covering down on this, but between the United States and Israel, I think there was obviously a gap that wasn't being filled using those resources. I'm sure that will be looked at.
Now, obviously, U.S. intelligence, when it came to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was spot on. And the U.S. did share that intelligence with Ukraine. As far as you can say, how was that intelligence gained?
So we didn't just share it with Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
We basically, the United States shared this intelligence, I think, with the world. A lot of it privately, but obviously a large amount of it also publicly for messaging effect and to impact, policy decisions conceivably in Moscow. A lot of that intelligence is gained through traditional means, but we obviously had months and months, if not a year plus, of sort of early indications. And so some of those resources from collection that I mentioned could probably be directed and shifted more toward this particular target.
So you're talking about massing of the troops along the borders, obviously.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of ways to get different kinds of information, whether it's imagery from satellites, other overhead assets, whether it's human intelligence, whether it's signals intelligence, other types of measures and signatures that we, and a lot of open source intelligence that we might collect on, frankly, often through the internet.
And as Ivan indicated, United States, as other country, we have human intelligence. And human intelligence often provides us the most important part of the puzzle, which is determining intent of the enemy. From a technical means, we can see movements, we can see things, we can hear things. But good human intelligence often provides us why and what, and that help us build up those necessary defenses and warn our allies and friends.
And I think you've mentioned before, Tony, that it's through the human intelligence that we get the intent. So it's prior to any sort of movement. Ivan, when we talk about China, when we're looking at China and the intelligence capabilities of the US and Taiwan as well, is there anything that stands in the way of maintaining those or expanding those capabilities, particularly with a communist system or particularly with Xi Jinping?
We could say particularly with communist system or Xi Jinping, but I think it's just particularly with a very, very capable adversary in this case that has very good counterintelligence practices, which we strive to also make things difficult. China, like you mentioned, I think has some natural advantages given the closed nature of their system to begin with, sort of just being not as transparent as we are, so that kind of top level of information is even harder to glean. But they're very aware of sort of very typical U.S. intelligence collection practices and are what we would consider to be a hard target, so very difficult to sort of access.
Yeah, and especially, William Burns, head of the CIA, of course, announced that, or let it be known that the US is trying to rebuild its spy networks in China, and in an environment where Xi Jinping has expanded anti-spy laws and, called on the whole of society in China to combat spies. This must be very, very difficult and perhaps, intentional, given that it knows that intelligence is so important to thwarting any invasion of Taiwan.
Yeah, honestly, I think the counter-espionage law in China that was passed, fairly recently, might even go over the line toward paranoia, and really start impacting China's own ability, and we're seeing it already, to function as a society, as an economy, and to integrate itself in the world for those purposes. And so there's some choices that Xi Jinping and the leadership are making now, are going to have to continue to make on finding the right balance there, either opening themselves up and potentially, in their view, being more exposed to U.S. intelligence collection, or closing themselves up and potentially, in that case, hurting their own economy.
So, Tony, you heard there that Ivan said, China's determination to try to remain closed. What is the advantage that intelligence brings, reconnaissance, surveillance? What sort of advantage would it bring in any war scenario?
Human intelligence takes years to develop. It takes years to develop an analyst who understand the enemy and can get into the minds of the enemies. It takes years to develop and validate an agent who is willing to work for you in hostile land to risk their lives. So these are assets that's just so valuable, yet you can lose it by one mishandling of a classified document or by a traitor who decides to work for your enemy. So, but this type of intelligence is critical because you want to be prepared in case the enemy does the unthinkable. So it's so important to make sure we have the capability to continuously monitor our adversaries.
So, Tony, you have in the past mentioned an actual figure of a number of days, and it amounts to a few weeks.
Well, it's my personal belief that United States and Taiwan should have about 30 days warning, because the United States have a tremendous technical capability, technical intelligence capability, as I mentioned earlier. And Taiwan actually has pretty robust human intelligence capability in China. So if we combine these two, I suspect we can formulate a picture of preparation for invasion. And I believe we should have about 30 days, and that's sufficient for coalition forces to forward deployed, and also hopefully the preparation Taiwan undertake, combining the two factors, it may by itself become a deterrent for China as far as initiating an attack.
Ivan, what's your assessment of that 30 days, and might even deter the actual invasion itself?
So I'm not sure I can put a time period on it. What is typically going to happen is we're going to see through various types of information collection, which is really what we're talking about here. We're going to see what we consider to be ambiguous indications for probably quite a while, maybe on the order of months, like, oh, it looks like they're doing something. Maybe it's an exercise. Maybe they're mobilizing for war. We're not sure. And then as it gets closer and closer, you'll see sort of more of those. And then eventually, as it gets real close, something that's less ambiguous. It's like, oh, wait. And in the case of Russia, I don't know if you remember, they started shipping like blood banks out, to the border area. And that was sort of something you don't really ever see in preparation for an exercise. And that maybe, our analysts might consider that to be unambiguous. But the point is that they'll, we'll get kind of more and more confidence as it gets closer. So I don't anticipate, a true surprise attack. Maybe you think about what happened in Israel. That was a raid. That wasn't to take territory, right? It was literally an act of terrorism to hurt people. I don't think that's, the intent behind anything China is about to do. You look at the Russia example, that was an intent to take territory, which is probably more of a parallel to what we would expect.
So given that intelligence, although there was some reluctance on the Ukrainian side, wasn't there, to actually believe that this was going to happen?
So I think we have to also consider the position that, President Zelensky was in and things like that, where he's trying to sort of keep his own population calm and ready and sort of not panicked. So that probably plays into his decision making. I think there was some level of probability that he assigned in his mind based on the information he was given, and then how he messaged that may be slightly different, right, depending on his own interests and what he needs to do to get his country ready, quite frankly. So I think that the U.S. was quite certain what was happening, was doing the things that we needed to do more as a coalition to prepare.
So that's bringing the NATO troops closer.
I think so, yeah.
Tony, very quickly, so Taiwan has set up a task force which is going to look into the Hamas attack. Intelligence is a key part of that. To you, what is it that Taiwan does well? What does it need to improve?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, human intelligence is what Taiwan does well. I think they should continue to build those because to get more unambiguous signals, often you need those human intelligence to confirm what you see through technical means and combine the two together. Now, technical means Taiwan has enough friends who's willing to share information with Taiwan. I think Taiwan doesn't have the resources to build its own. They can't have the RC-135 running often around the Chinese coast or its satellite constellations and
that's a reconnaissance plane, is it?
Right,
yeah.
Right. So therefore, friends around the region, such as Japan and other countries, Taiwan's friends, can provide those technical intelligence where if Taiwan can beef up those human intelligence so that it helps formulate a complete picture, I think that's important for Taiwan.
So Ivan, would you see that the task force, one of its priorities is that sort of alliance sharing model to work more closely with the US and also its allies in terms of that intelligence sharing?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I mean, to be honest, that's probably a goal that Taiwan had before the Hamas attack happened, right? So I'm not sure it necessarily changes anything in any real way. It's sort of like what resources do you have and how do you want to apply them, and what your relationship is with other partners. I think for Taiwan, there was probably some impact that the pandemic had for China also, which has, large human operations here in Taiwan. And there's probably a big impact during those couple years. And so maybe there are some rebuilding happening on both sides, frankly, right now. So from an intelligence and a counterintelligence perspective, probably important to be, increasing awareness.
Okay. My next guest believes the world is at a tipping point in global security. James R. Holmes is a J.C. Wylie Chair of Maritime Strategy at the U.S. Naval War College. I spoke to him earlier. Let's take a look.
There are certain actors out there in the international system that would like to cause a change of state, whether it's China vis-a-vis Taiwan or in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, perhaps, or obviously Russia and Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And as we've seen just over the past week, Iran perhaps wants to cause a change of state in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. That's a major thing that we have to come to terms with and try to figure out how to deal with, whether we are going to let them cause that change of state to happen or not.
Or you've asked about why the Ukraine war has not triggered the sort of response in the US military or Navy that the fall of France did in 1940 to Germany.
In the summer of 1940, the United States Navy in Congress had been rebuilding military power after the low points in the Depression and the arms control era to try to get ready for competition with Nazi Germany, with Japanese militarism and so forth. The fall of France really threw a scare into everybody and caused them to get their act together and pass what we call the Two Ocean Navy Act of 1940, under which the United States essentially built a second full navy so that it could keep a complete navy in the Atlantic theater and a complete navy on the Pacific coast as well, thus letting us handle challenges in both oceans. And so that was a major stimulus. Why has Ukraine not provided that sort of stimulus? I pointed out a few differences from now. For example, Japan by 1940 had already been at war in Manchuria and then in China for some years to come now. China today has deliberately tried to deny that sort of stimulus for adaptation on the part of the Asian powers and their allies from outside. So there's an element of deliberate choice on China's part. It is trying to keep the change of state, the energy that's adding into the system, bringing that change of state to a very low boil, so that it doesn't prompt a severe response from the United States and its allies. And that's sort of the biggest thing that I see. But again, it's the scale of the stimulus is simply not there.
Between the outbreaks of violence that we are seeing across the world, are there any connections?
Yeah, I do. The pragmatic point is that it makes sense for the adversaries of the system presided over by the United Nations, the United States, and its allies. I mean, they see fit to actually coordinate things to make trouble all over the map for the United States, so that they spread us thin. The theoretical point is one that goes all the way back to the 1940s, the great era of geopolitics, in which everybody agreed, such as Alfred Thayer Mahan, our second president at the War College. They agreed that Eurasia is the place on the planet that you need to control if you want to dominate events on the planet. And so the United States during the Cold War, more or less, its strategy was to more or less encircle Eurasia and control it from the sea, using sea and air forces in concert with ground forces. And if you're a hostile Eurasian power, the best thing you can do is push back against that. Why not make common cause in order to cause lots of challenges to the United States, so that it cannot be stronger or it cannot be strong enough to handle all of these challenges at every place on the map at every time. I don't know if there's deliberate collusion, but certainly there's a lot of opportunism going on between Russia, China, and Iran, and perhaps even other powers such as North Korea.
That was James Holmes of the US Naval War College speaking to me earlier. Meanwhile, Taiwan's defense ministry says China is ramping up military activity in the skies and the waters around Taiwan. On September 17th, the People's Liberation Army sent 40 planes in a 24-hour period across the Taiwan's median line, the unofficial boundary separating China and Taiwan. The planes flew into the southeast and southwestern corners of Taiwan's air defense zone, close to, though not into, Taiwan's sovereign airspace. Tony, so in the days around that day, in a 24-hour period, China actually sent upward of 50 planes as I said, in a 24-hour period across the median line and into Taiwan's ADIZ. So tell us, how is China ramping up this activity around Taiwan?
Of course, this is mainly training. However, we must recognize it as it's militarily insignificant, because each time they send these aircraft, they are 2Zs and 4Zs. They're not like 40 aircraft fully loaded in combat formation, trying to attack Taiwan. I think the purpose, in addition to training their own pilots, and it's also trying to get Taiwan to get into a state of complacency where when they actually attack, maybe the military is not as alert as they should be. And the second purpose, obviously, is the intimidation of the people on Taiwan to demonstrate that China has those military might. But in fact, if China does decide to attack Taiwan, it's not going to be so easy. And right now they're still in ADIZ, which they're detected early. And Taiwan has a very robust integrated air missile defense system that can take on these type of strikes.
Ivan, so we heard there Tony saying, it's about building complacency, getting Taiwanese comfortable with this level of activity. You believe, from what we've spoken about before, that the way Taiwan reports is not the best way to do this. Can you explain to me why that is?
Yeah, I guess it's not optimal because I agree with Tony. I think the two main reasons for these flights are exercises. As the PLA continues to build up its overwater capability and on the water capability, its power projection, right? It does need to train and exercise, just like any military of that type would. And the second reason clearly is the political messaging effect. So it's not actually saying, I'm attacking you today, but kind of, the message. And the way that I think the Taiwan government is reporting it, referencing the ADIZ may not be the best mode. For example, Japan around its Southwest Islands has a large ADIZ too, and I don't think you'll rarely, if ever, see Japan talking about the continuous PLA incursions into that ADIZ.
Which are actually on a par with or even more than Taiwan.
More than Taiwan. In the United States, when we do talk about Russian aircraft crossing near Alaska into our ADIZ, we typically, the United States government, the U.S. Air Force will make it a point to say this was not a threat. We kind of watch, and we don't consider it a threat. And so I think it's important to kind of keep that in context, and that Taiwan maybe should reference the center line and maybe even reference its own territorial seas and contiguous zone more so than the ADIZ.
Some analysts are saying that the recent activity, though, wasn't accompanied by the usual propaganda. And so they feel that it really is focused on this training of encircling Taiwan, of coming, say, from the east. Do you see this activity as a change, or do you see it more of the same?
I think it's more of the same. And to be clear, I absolutely agree that China's increasing over time, right, over the trend line, this activity, as its own capabilities increase. But that's 100%, I think, what we would expect as we've watched the PLA develop over years, if not decades. And the fact that they can fly around to the east and refuel their aircraft in the air is a capability they want to show. It doesn't necessarily indicate an intent that they're about to attack, though.
So to tell us more about that capability, why is it important for them to be practicing this?
So, our aircraft in the United States also, refuel to stay airborne longer. It gives you more time on station, quite frankly. It's much more efficient than having to launch new aircraft and land the ones that are already airborne, especially if you're not actually expending your ordnance during that time. So China, this is sort of an advancement for China as they build their power projection capability. They've been refueling for a while, but the more they do it, the larger scale their exercises, it demonstrates that they're becoming, as they would say, a first-class military.
Tony, we heard from Ivan there about the practice that the US does now the Chinese. So the Chinese has got some catching up to do in terms of fighting, combating these other militaries.
Absolutely. The Chinese are used to short duration flights, 1 hour, an hour and a half. And our pilots, Ivan, I'm sure, have pulled 4 or 5 hour flights easy, multiple air refuelings. He's done in his F-18s. So if China wants to conduct a large-scale operation, they have to have their aircraft being able to stay airborne as long as they have air ordnance on board. On the other hand, flying on the east side of Taiwan actually is not a location that's good for the Chinese, because they'd be caught between the weapon engagement zone of Taiwan and possibly coalition forces coming from the east side. So
it's not a traditionally weaker side, the east.
I wouldn't call that a weaker side. Taiwan has built up its defenses on the east side through the past 10 years. Once they realize China can get on that side and can launch weapons from that side. So Taiwan has built up a lot of the air defense systems on the east side. On the other hand, like I said, the coalition forces will be coming from that same side. So any Chinese forces, either air, sea, or underwater forces that's in that area, they're really sandwiched. So from the military point of view, that's not a good place to be.
Ivan, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I mean, look, the Chinese have had bombers that can fly over toward Guam and back and come at Taiwan from the east for many years now. So it's not a new threat to be able to attack the island. The fact that their fighters are doing it more and more maybe indicates something, but again, not a significant threat to the island as much as just an indication of their overall military capabilities. I mean, I would tell you it's a bit like the aircraft carriers, which I don't assess are a significant threat to Taiwan at all, but they're an indication of China's ability to project power. And if I was a really small nation a lot farther away than Taiwan that was making China angry, I might worry about an aircraft carrier. If I'm Taiwan, I'd be a lot more worried about what they have, just 100 miles to the west.
Okay. Well, we'll probably have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Ivan Kanapathy and Tony Hu, for joining us today.